Betty Williams gazed at the city lights through the window of her luxury apartment in Beacon Hill, adjacent to Boston's financial district. Though she maintained a youthful appearance, behind her calm eyes lay complex emotions, a mixture of patience and resignation cultivated over many years. Born as the eldest daughter of the Williams family, Betty had majored in finance at Harvard University and immediately joined a major investment firm on Wall Street after graduation. Now, she worked as a senior analyst at a prominent financial institution in Boston, respected throughout the industry for her analytical skills and insight. Her portfolio management consistently generated stable returns, earning her clients deep trust. "Betty, could you come to the family home this weekend? I have something to discuss." Her mother Martha's voice sounded excited over the phone. "It's wonderful news." Betty sighed softly and checked her calendar. "All right, Mom. What time works for you?" "Noon would be perfect. Your father and Vanessa will be there too." Just hearing her sister's name created small ripples in Betty's heart. From childhood, Vanessa had been the family's sunshine. Bright and sociable, she had served as captain of the cheerleading squad in school and was crowned homecoming queen. Betty, on the other hand, preferred spending time in the library, earning excellent grades without any flashiness. On Saturday, when Betty arrived at the Williams suburban mansion, Vanessa's crimson sports car was already parked in the driveway. As she opened the door, laughter drifted from the living room. "Oh, Betty's here," Martha noticed her daughter, her voice tinged with slight disappointment. "Dear, you're always dressed so plainly, you could try to be more fashionable sometimes." "Hello, Mom," Betty smiled as she kissed her mother. The simple navy dress fit her slender figure well. Vanessa appeared in a vibrant pink summer dress, laughing with their father George. "Betty." Vanessa rushed over to her sister, giving her a quick hug that left behind the strong scent of perfume. "Today is a special day." In the living room, George stood in good spirits with a whiskey in hand. "Finally made it, Betty. You're always punctual," he said in a tone that sounded like a compliment but wasn't quite. "Is something special happening?" Betty asked as she sat down. "Special doesn't begin to cover it." Vanessa clung to her father's arm and displayed a large, sparkling diamond ring. "I'm engaged to Reed Foster." Martha wiped away tears of joy. Reed graduated from Harvard Law School and is now a hugely successful broker dealing in luxury real estate. "Finally, one of my daughters will build a wonderful family." The words felt like a denial of Betty's very existence. Maintaining her smile, Betty turned to her sister and said, "Congratulations, Vanessa. Tell me about him." "Oh, come on. I've talked about Reed so many times." "You even met him at last year's Christmas party," Vanessa complained, but Betty had no recollection of this. Last Christmas, she had left early for an important project after briefly greeting her family. Throughout dinner, conversation centered on plans for Vanessa and Reed's extravagant engagement party. They would rent a historic mansion in Newport and invite the elite of Boston society. "Betty, you'll need to buy a lovely dress," Martha said. "And perhaps?" She touched her daughter's shoulder, "You might want to diet a bit? No dress will look good otherwise." Betty's figure was average, but in her mother's eyes, there was always room for improvement. She nodded silently, lowering her eyes to her plate. George didn't join the conversation, enthusiastically discussing Vanessa and Reed's future instead. "Where did you meet Reed?" Betty asked, and Vanessa's eyes lit up. "At a Winter Garden charity event. He was one of the organizers." Betty recognized the name. Winter Garden Charity. Something triggered her professional instinct. "You're always so focused on work," Martha interrupted. "Vanessa is social, that's why she has such wonderful encounters. You should learn from her." George chimed in, "Betty's smart. But men are intimidated by overly intelligent women. If you behaved more femininely, you might find happiness like Vanessa." Betty smiled quietly. Such comments from her parents and sister had become routine. She knew her own worth. Yet sometimes, the pain of being treated as second best, or worse, in her family couldn't be erased. "The engagement party is the first Saturday of next month," Vanessa said. "You'll come, right?" Betty nodded. "Of course. As she spoke, she felt an inexplicable uneasiness. The name Reed Foster seemed strangely familiar. The lavish engagement party invitation arrived at Betty's apartment on a rainy Wednesday. Opening the envelope with gold foil embossing, she found beautiful calligraphy dancing across thick ivory paper. Please join us in celebrating the engagement of Vanessa Williams and Reed Foster. Holding the invitation, Betty stood by the window. Watching raindrops slide down the glass, she recalled past family gatherings. 8 years ago, at her father's 60th birthday party. The night her mother announced to everyone, "My daughter excels at work, but she's missing something important as a woman." 5 Christmases ago. When relatives gathered, an uncle asked, "When is Betty getting married?" and Vanessa laughed, "My sister married her computer," while everyone joined in. 3 years ago, on Vanessa's birthday. "This girl is so popular with men. So different from Betty," her mother had said, tipsy, while her father raised his glass, "Vanessa is our pride." Betty took a deep breath and placed the invitation on the dining table. She could choose to run away, fearing more hurt. But she loved her sister. Despite all the comparisons and wounds, Vanessa was her only sister. "I should go," she told herself. "It's my sister's special day." That night, Betty opened her laptop and accessed her work database. Telling herself it was mere curiosity, she typed Reed Foster's name in the search field. Initially, she just wanted to learn more about her sister's fiancé. The search results were superficial: photographs from parties and charity events, articles about real estate transactions. Reed was indeed a handsome man and a Harvard Law School graduate. His company, Foster Luxury Estates, had grown rapidly over the past 3 years, handling high-end properties in Boston and New York. "He's no ordinary success story," Betty murmured, studying the screen. As a business intelligence specialist, she excelled at reading the stories behind numbers. Reed's company's growth rate was abnormal. Usually, such rapid expansion required substantial investment or exceptional connections. The next day, Betty delved deeper into company databases. She discovered that some properties Reed dealt with were being traded through investment trusts. The pattern looked familiar. The shocking discovery came after she returned home. Checking past files on her home computer, she found materials from an investment fraud case she had analyzed 5 years earlier. Looking at a photograph of one of the main suspects, Betty gasped. "It can't be." The man in the photo, despite different hair and beard styles, was unmistakably Reed Foster. Back then, his name was Richard Farman. He had been part of a fraud group that swindled around $20 million from hundreds of investors. Though insufficient evidence had prevented his indictment, he had been investigated as an associate. With trembling hands, Betty spread out the materials. Richard Farman, now Reed Foster, had disappeared after the fraud case and reappeared 3 years ago as a different person. He had changed his name, appearance, and career. But his methods remained unchanged. The possibility of a new fraud scheme through luxury real estate emerged. "I must protect Vanessa." That weekend, Betty visited her parents' home with the evidence she had gathered. She had decided to talk to her parents first. But as soon as she began, her words were cut off. "Are you starting with your delusions again?" Martha said tiredly. "Always jealous of others' happiness." "This isn't jealousy, Mom," Betty said calmly. "These are facts. Reed was involved in investment fraud 5 years ago under the name Richard Farman. Do you have any proof?" George looked skeptically at his daughter. When Betty presented her materials, George glanced at them briefly and shook his head. "This proves nothing. There are plenty of men who look similar." "But Dad." "Enough," George raised his voice. "You're just trying to ruin your sister's happiness. At your age, still jealous of Vanessa." Betty felt despair that her parents refused to see the truth. As she was leaving, she crossed paths with Vanessa at the entrance. "Vanessa, I need to talk to you." The two faced each other in Vanessa's room. Betty calmly presented the evidence, explaining Reed's true identity. But Vanessa's reaction was predictable. "That's impossible!" Vanessa shouted. "You're always trying to ruin my happiness. Reed is a different person. These photos just look similar." Vanessa, please be rational. I'm only trying to protect you. No. Tears of anger welled in Vanessa's eyes. You're a lonely loser who can't stand my happiness. Stop speaking ill of Reed. Watching Vanessa storm out, Betty made a decision. Further verbal persuasion was futile. She needed to demonstrate the truth through action. Back home, Betty continued investigating Reed's past and current activities. She thoroughly examined his background, owned companies, and transaction patterns. For the first time, her skills and knowledge as a financial analyst would serve her family. 3 days before the engagement party, Betty packed the evidence documents into a small box. It was her first genuine act of defiance against her family. The historic Vanderbilt mansion in Newport radiated brilliance reminiscent of a bygone golden age that night. The grand hall, decorated with champagne gold ornaments, hosted Boston's social elite while crystal chandeliers cast soft light from the ceiling. Betty entered the venue quietly. Her emerald green evening dress accentuated her intellectual beauty, displaying an elegance different from her usual businesswoman appearance. As she entered, several gazes turned toward her but quickly shifted to indifference. She wasn't escorting anyone, nor did she possess exciting conversation topics. She was merely Vanessa's sister. Betty, you came, Martha approached. Wearing a glamorous silver dress, her mother's expression showed slight tension. You'll behave today, won't you? Of course, Mom, Betty smiled. She clutched her small black bag, confirming the presence of the box inside. Your seat is over there, Martha pointed to a corner of the hall, a position as far as possible from the main table. Betty nodded silently and headed toward her assigned seat. En route, she saw Vanessa and Reed surrounded by guests. Vanessa sparkled like a movie star in her ivory designer dress. Reed, handsome in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, smiled as he chatted with guests. When Betty took her seat, the table was occupied by distant relatives of her father and a couple who were daughters of her mother's friends. They exchanged brief greetings before returning to their previous conversation. No one showed interest in her. The party proceeded as planned. As waiters served premium champagne and hors d'oeuvres, and a string quartet played elegant music, Betty barely touched her glass, silently waiting for time to pass. Eventually, after dinner, the time came for speeches and special toasts. George stood up and took the microphone. Thank you all for gathering today to celebrate the engagement of our family's jewel, Vanessa, and the wonderful gentleman Reed Foster. Applause erupted from the audience. Vanessa has brought light to our lives since birth. Her smile, intelligence, and warmth are impossible not to love. And now, she's about to share her life with an equally wonderful man. George continued praising Reed's false family background, education, and business success. Let's raise a toast to Vanessa and Reed's happy future. As everyone raised their champagne glasses, Martha suddenly spoke up. Oh, I just remembered, our other daughter is here today too. Martha looked around and waved at Betty. Betty, stand up and say hello to everyone. The room fell silent as Betty slowly rose. Her heart was racing, but her expression remained calm. This girl was a straight-A student in college, Martha said in a slightly elevated voice. Tension began to permeate the room. But she's not good at parties like this. Always in front of a computer. She'll probably stay single forever. How embarrassing. Martha's words brought silence to the venue. Betty felt her cheeks burn but maintained her smile. Then Vanessa laughed. Would anyone like to take my poor, plain sister? She's really a good person. Vanessa's words initially created an awkward atmosphere, but soon several people began to chuckle, spreading throughout the venue. Even Reed made no attempt to hide his smile. Amidst the laughter, Betty calmly stood, retrieving the small box from her clutch. As the laughter gradually subsided, she approached the main table. Vanessa, Betty said quietly. Congratulations. This is a special gift from me. Vanessa looked confused but accepted the box to avoid appearing rude in front of guests. Thank you, what is it? Open it, Betty said. Her voice was soft yet somehow carried throughout the hall. Driven by curiosity, Vanessa untied the ribbon on the small box. Inside were several photographs and documents. She took out the first photo and examined it closely. It showed a younger Reed, with a different hairstyle, identified as Richard Farman. Next to it was a headline, "Investment Fraud Suspect." The color visibly drained from Vanessa's face. She withdrew the next document, which detailed Reed's criminal record, the fraud cases he was involved in, and most shockingly, evidence that his current real estate company was misappropriating investor funds. "This is unbelievable." Vanessa's voice shook. She stared at Reed. "Is this true?" Reed was momentarily stunned but quickly tried to compose himself. "Vanessa, what are you talking about? Come on, we're about to get married, and your sister is playing some strange joke." "This is no joke," Betty said calmly. She took out another document from her clutch. "This is a forensic report showing that Richard Farman's fingerprints match Reed Foster's. I worked with a financial fraud investigator to gather all the evidence." The venue erupted into chaos. The composed expression vanished from Reed's face, replaced by panic. "This is a misunderstanding," he shouted. "There was just someone who looked like me in the past. Vanessa, believe me." But Vanessa already held conclusive evidence in her hands. The engagement ring slipped from her finger and rolled across the floor. "Isn't that Farman?" a voice rose from the back of the hall. It was a senior investment industry figure who remembered the fraud case. One of the perpetrators of that $8 million scam. Reed, wearing an expression of someone who had lost all escape routes, glared at Betty. What have you done?" "I've delivered justice," Betty answered quietly. "I've protected my sister." George and Martha stood dumbfounded. Her father's face reddened with anger, while her mother covered her face in shame. "How do you explain this?" one of the venue's dignitaries confronted George. "Choosing a con artist as your daughter's spouse." Vanessa collapsed in tears, and Martha rushed to comfort her. But Vanessa pushed away her mother's arms. "Why didn't you notice? Why didn't you listen to Betty?" Reed began moving toward the exit in a panic. The venue was in complete disarray. Betty stood silently, watching everything unfold. The chaos in the hall reached its peak. Reed tried to rush toward the exit, but several guests blocked his path. "I've changed," Reed desperately cried out. "I admit my past mistakes. But I'm a different person now." Betty quietly stepped forward and withdrew the final piece of evidence from her clutch. "I'm afraid you haven't changed at all," she said coolly. "These are transaction records from your current real estate company. Over the past 3 months, you've been moving funds collected from investors to offshore accounts through 5 shell companies." She placed the documents on the table. Judge Emerson, a renowned federal judge present at the venue, stepped forward and examined the papers. "This is rather detailed evidence," the judge said, furrowing his brow. "How did you obtain this?" "I'm a specialist in financial crime analysis," Betty answered. "I used all my skills and knowledge to protect my sister. All information was legally obtained." The blood had completely drained from Reed's face. "Vanessa, believe me. I truly love you." But Vanessa wouldn't even look at him anymore. "You've caused such embarrassment." Martha confronted Betty. "How could you destroy your sister's engagement in such a public manner?" George also spoke with a voice trembling with anger. "Why didn't you tell us first? Why use such a shameful method?" "I did tell you," Betty replied quietly. "You wouldn't listen. You said I was jealous and envious of my sister's happiness." Judge Emerson took out his cell phone, saying, "This clearly requires an investigation by the authorities," and began making a call. From another corner of the venue, an elderly woman who had previously been a victim of Reed's fraud raised her voice. "My husband lost everything in that scam and died from the shock. Arrest that man." Amidst the confusion, Betty looked toward Vanessa. Her sister had collapsed into a chair, sitting in a daze. Seeing her covering her face with both hands, trembling as she cried, Betty felt heartbroken. She slowly tried to approach her sister, but at that moment, Reed suddenly moved. "I won't forgive this," Reed shouted, grabbing a knife from a nearby table. His eyes were filled with madness. It's all your fault. As he took a step toward Betty, 2 security guards at the venue tackled Reed and restrained him. The knife fell to the floor, its metallic sound echoing off the marble. Calm down, one guard said. The police are already here. Indeed, uniformed officers were already arriving at the entrance, trying to assess the situation. Judge Emerson could be seen approaching the officers, explaining the circumstances. Betty took a deep breath, trying to steady her trembling hands. She tried to approach her sister, but Vanessa looked up, staring at Betty with an expression contorted by anger and humiliation. It's all your fault. Vanessa cried out. Why did you reveal this in such a humiliating way? You could have told just me privately. You wouldn't have believed me, Betty answered sadly. No one would have. Does that give you the right to humiliate me in front of all these people? Vanessa's voice quivered painfully. You've always tried to steal my light. Now you've finally succeeded. Martha rushed to Vanessa's side, embracing her daughter. It's okay, you did nothing wrong. You were just deceived. George stared at Betty with a confused expression. In his proud eyes was a mixture of anger, confusion, and a very faint, glimmer of recognition. But he said nothing and walked over to his wife and daughter. As officers escorted Reed out, Betty stood silently. Around her, guests discussed the event in uproar, with some approaching to say, well done. Yet she remained completely isolated from her family. Ms. Williams, Judge Emerson approached. That was a courageous act. The evidence you've gathered is extremely valuable. The police are already seeking your cooperation. Betty nodded silently. He will undoubtedly be imprisoned, the judge continued. You've saved many people from his next scam. Those words gave Betty a slight sense of comfort. But she also keenly felt that the rift with her family had become irreparable. One of the officers approached Betty. Ms. Williams, could you come to the police station tomorrow? We need your testimony. As she nodded, she spotted Vanessa at the edge of the venue, supported by Martha as they headed for the exit. George followed behind them but paused at the door, turning back to look at Betty. His expression was unreadable, but he seemed to nod briefly, almost imperceptibly. Then he turned away and followed his family. The venue gradually quieted as guests departed, carrying their trembling excitement and shock. Betty remained alone, standing in the center of the empty party hall. The chandelier light swayed softly around her, and the fallen engagement ring gleamed lonely on the floor. She picked up the ring and held it in her palm. The diamond sparkled in the light, but its brilliance seemed cold and false. Just like Reed's love. Miss, an elderly waiter approached her. Are you leaving now? Betty came to her senses and nodded. Yes, I'm leaving. She picked up her clutch and quietly left the venue. The night air in Newport was cold, with stars spread across the sky. While calling a taxi, she briefly considered her actions. There was regret for hurting her family, but more strongly, she felt a sense of liberation. For years, she had been a shadow in her family. Always second best, always the target of criticism, always just Vanessa's sister. But tonight, she had stood up for herself for the first time. Her actions might have destroyed her relationship with her family. But at the same time, they had freed her from the chains that had bound her for years. As she got into the taxi, her cell phone rang. It was an unknown number. Betty Williams speaking, she answered. Ms. Williams, this is FBI agent James Collins, a male voice responded. I'd like to speak with you further about the information you provided. Gazing out the car window, Betty replied, of course, I'll cooperate. In her heart, she felt satisfaction that she had protected her sister from Reed, who had been lying to her family. Even if it meant being ostracized by her family, she believed it was the right choice. Also, Ms. Williams, the FBI agent's voice continued. Thank you for your courage and expertise. Many people will be saved thanks to your actions. The taxi left Newport and entered the highway toward Boston. Betty leaned her head against the window, looking up at the starry sky. Something inside her was beginning to change. The woman who had shaped herself according to her family's expectations and criticisms for years was, for the first time, trying to find her true self. A month passed after the party. From Betty's apartment window stretched Boston's autumn scenery. Red and gold leaves colored the trees along the Charles River, and morning light gently embraced the city. Her phone had stopped ringing weeks ago. There was no contact from her family, and Vanessa's social media accounts had been set to private. She had heard rumors that her parents had distanced themselves from her as a family disgrace, telling friends that Betty ruined her sister's marriage out of jealousy. Betty took a sip of coffee and opened the morning paper. The trial of Reed Foster, born Richard Farman, had begun. The article reported he was charged with multiple counts of fraud and expected to receive a sentence of more than a decade. The intercom at the entrance rang. Slightly nervous about the unexpected visitor, Betty opened the door. Ms. Williams, a man in a suit, stood there. "I'm Michael Harrison from Greenwood Partners Law Firm." She invited the lawyer into her home. "Actually, I represent the victims of Richard Farman, now Reed Foster's fraud," Harrison explained. "Thanks to your courageous act, many victims have been able to obtain justice. They wish to express their gratitude." The lawyer withdrew documents from his briefcase. "The victims have established a foundation using part of the recovered assets, dedicated to financial fraud prevention and victim support. And they wish for you to serve as the foundation's chairperson." Betty's eyes widened in surprise. "Me? Your expertise in financial crimes and courage to stand up for justice are exactly the qualities we're seeking." 1 year later, on Christmas Eve, Betty's New Beginning Foundation office was adorned with modest yet warm holiday decorations. She had stayed late, reviewing documents for a new victim support program. There was a knock at the door, and her secretary peeked in. "Ms. Williams, you have a visitor." Standing behind the door was Vanessa, with a worn expression. She had lost her former radiance, with signs of fatigue beneath her eyes. "Betty." Vanessa's voice trembled. "Will you listen to what I have to say?" The sisters sat in a small cafe. Vanessa tearfully explained. After Reed's arrest, their parents had lost their social reputation, Martha had been excluded from Boston society, and George had been distanced by his business partners. Then came the final blow. Vanessa had begun dating another man, but he too turned out to be a con artist who swindled most of her remaining assets. "I couldn't see anything," Vanessa clutched her coffee cup with trembling hands. "You were right. If I had listened to your warning." Betty gently touched her sister's hand. "We can't change the past. But we can choose what to do from now on." "What about our parents?" Betty quietly asked. "They still won't admit their mistakes," Vanessa answered sadly. "They even refuse to mention your name." Betty gazed at the snowy scene outside the window. True family isn't just about blood ties. It's about respecting and supporting each other. She took a business card from her inner pocket and handed it to her sister. "Would you like to start as an intern at my foundation? It's never too late to restart your life." Tears welled in Vanessa's eyes. "Even someone like me?" "Especially someone like you," Betty smiled. "Come, let's welcome a new beginning together." Outside the window, snow continued to fall quietly. It was as if gently covering the wounds of the past, spreading a pure white page filled with new possibilities.